Hello and welcome to Dr. Gakman's Nintendo Power Checklist. This is Dr. Gakman here. We're going to be covering the year of 1996. Woo! It's the launch year for what was at first called the NU64, the Nintendo Ultra 64, or just Ultra 64. But later they changed the name because of licensing problems with Konami and Ultra Games. They called it just simply Nintendo 64. This is the first volume of the year. It is the bonus issue, 1996, January 80, volume 80. So this is a wraparound cover, and it's also an open door cover. The newsstand cover, now this is like the bonus issue that subscribers got. At this point, they don't really I think this is the year that they kind of slow down and do away with the super power supplies, or not super power supplies, super power club moniker, and just subscribers are just subscribers. They get bonus stuff, blah blah blah. But the actual, I don't have the actual newsstand cover, and I can't find a good picture of this. I know it was for, I think, Donkey Kong Country 2, or simply it was just Diddy riding on the back of a Nintendo 64 controller. Here I am going in the wrong direction, but as you can see, it says Ultra 64, not Nintendo 64. But yeah, there's images of these little cubes with different Nintendo 64 games coming, and there's Diddy right there. But that's what the cover looks like. It is kind of like that, but it says Nintendo Power. This is like a clean cover and bigger. That's what happens when you open the doors of the front cover of the this magazine. The centerfold for this, by the way, this is all staple bound. This year, 1996, they went back to staple binding. They never went back to that again. Thank goodness, because staple binding, it's hard for collectors. All of mine are pretty much intact. I think a couple of my staples are like either really bent out of shape or whatever. But when you find these to try to collect these, the staple binding really messes them up. You find them with missing covers or just ripped apart, or this, that, or the other. So I'm not too sure why they went with staple binding. They did away with the power supplies, or the Power Super Power Club trading cards in '95. They still would have cards throughout 1996, but I guess they wanted better access to the centerfolds. I don't know. I'm not too sure exactly why they did that, but they went back to regular binding, paper-bound binding, with 1997. So, but for 96, they're all staple bound, and I had to meticulously take all of these out of the staples in order to get the front and back covers. At first, I wasn't going to do that, but then I was like, I'll go ahead and do that, because some of these don't really make sense unless you take them out, because they're all bent up and blah blah blah. It wasn't like a centerfold, like here it is in the center of the book and it just comes out. No, it was like an actual poster centerfold that was bound into it by staples, and then you could take them out and blah blah blah. But here's Kong's 96. It's a calendar from January to June, and then from July to December you got the Krems, or Kremlings 96. So that's the back part of that centerfold. And I guess this is a bonus. I'm not too sure. I don't see it on anybody else's checklist, but it is. It's not really perforated. I can't really tell, but it was an Earthworm Jim 2 board game or paper game that was kind of like, it wasn't like, it felt like the paper was a little bit thicker on this. So that makes me think that it was some kind of bonus or whatever. I'm just making that up on my own list. I don't know if newsstand people got this, but subscribers certainly did. And here's the name of the game. It's Dumb Cow Game, no MSG. So I guess you're supposed to cut this out and play like a tabletop or board game with this. It's like seems to be a maze where you have to make it to the center, blah, blah, blah. There are people trying to sell this on eBay for high dollars. I'll tell you, this was an insert for subscribers. Maybe it was in the newsstand one too. My mistake was I thought for a while when I was checking checklists that it was actually, you know how AOL at that time was giving out discs like crazy. They had, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, like all of these discs. Sometimes they went crazy with them and made card discs or special shaped discs or, like mini discs or whatever that basically installed America Online onto your computer through a CD-ROM. And I thought that that's what this was, but actually it's just a card. It is giving you the keyword Nintendo for Nintendo or for America Online members. This is back in the days of dial-up when internet was just starting to take off and everything. Here's the back of the card, which has like some stats. And it also has perforation here. You can punch out this. It's supposed to be like a card, I guess. This signed card, but I didn't punch mine out because this is actually worth something to some people, especially collectors in Nintendo Power Magazine. Here's the other side of the perforated card there. And then here's a look back at Nintendo's website back then, the Nintendo Power Source. Yeah. It's crazy stuff. That was the inside of the card. There was no disc with this. So check your stuff. If you were thinking it was a disc and you're like, oh man, in order to complete this volume, I have to find this card or this. I thought it was an envelope, because they were made of cardboard too, with the disc inside. But we are now finally at February 1996. This is volume 81. And this is a slow year. You'll notice this as we go through these. This is a slow year because Nintendo was doing a lot of stuff in the background to try to make a successful Nintendo 64 launch. The Saturn was failing pretty hard in America. PlayStation was getting some footing. Sony was, and Nintendo was obviously. This is before pre-Dream Team era in their history, but they were, I don't want to say struggling, but there was definitely, the pipeline of games was not as huge as what the Super Nintendo and the NES was before it. So they focused on this arcade game, Killer Instinct 2, which was supposed to come to... it says coming soon to your homes in 1995 was the first game. Now here's the second game, and I don't think it made that bold claim because, here it is 96. But they were still calling it Nintendo Ultra 64. And we knew that Killer Instinct was going to come to it. This is Killer Instinct 2, KI2, and the arcades now. There was a lot of other Dream Team / Ultra 64, what do you call it? Arcade games like Cruis'n USA and a couple other ones. Nintendo 64 had that, and they also had what was called the Alex 64, more of a Japanese thing, for the arcade cabinets that was based off of Nintendo 64 hardware. Here is the centerfold for February, volume 81. It's Ken Griffey Jr.'s winning run. And on the back of the centerfold, there is Donkey Kong Country 2. These are, what do they call this? The Donkey Kong Country 2's Cranky's top 10 tips for getting to 102%. So they made the joke, you know, getting 100% was a big deal. Now there's 102%. Okay, so March. We've got March volume 82, which is Super Mario RPG. Now this was right around the time when things fell obviously through for the Nintendo 64, or for the Super Nintendo add-on. This was one of the games that I believe was planned for that. One of the later games, but of course it never came out, so we won't know the whole truth of this. But Squaresoft was still under Nintendo's wing at this point, and they made a RPG game, and they used AMC type, like Donkey Kong pre-rendered type graphics, and a kind of like a pseudo 2.5D like fixed perspective viewpoint that was like, you know, it was two-dimensional, but it made it look three-dimensional, even though you're walking around in a 2D plane. I thought the graphics were great on it, and it was very stylized, and yeah, it was interesting. But that enough about that game. This was coming to a near the end of an era for Nintendo and for Square. This is probably the last major game that Square would ever make for Nintendo, you know, going into the PlayStation era. Here's War of the Gems, and around this time Capcom had Marvel license, and there was the Marvel arcade game, Marvel Superheroes. This was before they had X-Men vs. Street Fighter, which was based off of some PlayStation arcade hardware. A lot of those games ended up going to PlayStation because, you know, they were just easy to port over, and Sony made good inroads with third parties because of that, especially Japanese ones. So, but I love this artwork. It's really nice. On the back of that centerfold is Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island, Most Wanted. So these are just some goofy things. Baby Bowser. These were the kinds of cards that they put in here, which they're not heavily perforated, so luckily they don't just fall apart when you go to try to pick them up. And that was good because they don't fall apart when you take them out of the staple binding. As you can see, they're staple bound in there. This is Mortal Kombat 3, and then here's the backs of the cards. They would continue to do that throughout this 1996. This is the Super Power Supplies catalog for spring of 1996. This would have been around March of 96 and volume 82 or thereabouts. And here's Earthworm Jim 2. Super Nintendo was still hitting it strong, and luckily, you know, because the Nintendo 64 was taking a bit too long to come out. And when it did come out, there was only a couple of games, and, you know, going into 97, there was definitely a lot more games, but they were mainly from Nintendo. The third parties, especially the Japanese ones, were pretty dry on 64. But that's a whole other history lesson. And you'll see that reflected in next year's Nintendo Power magazines as I go through them next month. But this month we're concentrating on 96. This is volume 83, April. Earthworm Jim 2. I love Earthworm Jim. And then the centerfold, kind of weird. It's the Game Boy Black Pearl game. Well, it says Super Nintendo as well. Olympic Summer Games. So, interesting centerfold. Not really. But this is Earthworm Jim 2. Speaking of, these are some maps on the back of the centerfold. Next volume is 84 for May 1996. And again, they keep talking about Nintendo 64. I think this is around the time when they stopped calling it Ultra 64 or Nintendo Ultra 64 or NU 64. and did finally change the name to N64. It was already, 64, I think, especially caught on with a lot of people because, well, not a lot of people, but certain people in the gaming community because of Commodore 64. 64 for Nintendo 64 was referring to 64-bit, whereas, I think it was kilobits, 64 kilobit. I think that's the memory or something for Commodore 64. Anyways, there we go again with Ken Griffey Jr. And I want to say that this is coming off after the baseball strikes. I can't remember exactly when it was. It was like mid-90s, going into late 90s. There was some Major League Baseball strikes and blah, blah, blah. But this was a big deal. This is he was with the Seattle Mariners, which Nintendo owned. Well, at the time it was Hiroshi Yamauchi who owned it, but it basically Nintendo's baby. Here's Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars for Super Nintendo, the centerfold, and in the middle of that is Jammin' College Slam Codes. Yeah, even for Game Boy. So, and then in the center of that, they had more stapled cards in place. Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars. Here's the backs of those cards. Everybody loves Geno right here, this little character. Here is next volume, which is June. Volume number 85 for 1996. And it's Mario 64, but yet it's not, because the cover is Nintendo 64. Nintendo 64 Blowout, basically. But it's also talking about other games that are coming out that year, or later in the year when Nintendo 64 launches. So I like this block. That's basically what the cover is, because another cover in the future, once 64 launches, is when Super Mario 64 is on the cover. But this is a Game Boy game. Iron Man, Stark, get it right there, S-T-A-R-K. Iron Man, Exo, Man-O-War in heavy metal. So this is a game on the centerfold, and then on the back of the centerfold there's these trick trades for Ken Griffey Jr. I think this is Winning Run at this point. Let me double check that in my notes. Yep, Ken Griffey Jr.'s Winning Run trick trades. I guess this was a way to make your dream team by, trading to people or trading to other teams and getting people from other teams on, whatever team that you were playing as in the game. Here is volume 86, which is July. We're already halfway through the year, 1996. And this one also is not a cover boy kind of thing. It just says Power Previews. So this is E3, Super Mario 64, Pilot Wings 64, and more. So you got Tetris Attack up here. You got Diddy. You got the Bowser from Super Mario RPG. You've got Kirby down here, although that's a really weird looking Kirby, isn't it? So there you go. And in the center of this is an unreleased game. You can find prototypes of this if you emulate, or if you want to actually put it on an EverDrive 64 to actually play it on your 64, of Robotech. Now this was something that was like a big deal. The next generation after that, and during the GameCube era, there was actually a really good Robotech game that was made. But up until then, this was, I think, an arcade game in Japan, Macross, or they were just fooling around with that while also making a Nintendo 64 game. This Crystal Dreams, man, it was, this was a rough situation. I think GameTech had the rights to make a Robotech game, And I think there had been other attempts before to make Robotech games that either failed or never got off the ground. This is one of the most notable ones, though. But they even made a poster for it, like as if it was actually coming right away, which it wasn't, and it never did come. On the back of that is, can you top this? These are like little crazy things that you can do to extend the life of gameplay for Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars. Now that started a whole other franchise. I mean, going into Paper Mario and other Mario RPGs and Mario and Luigi games. I mean, that's just pretty crazy, but still people crave an actual true sequel made by Square and Nintendo again, but who knows if that'll ever happen. Here's Tetris Attack, but you'll notice these are always riddled with Nintendo 64 stuff. This is for volume 87 of August 1996. And in the centerfold here is, hey, how you doing? Pilot Wings 64. This was the other launch title. There was only 2 launch titles for Nintendo 64. Now, Pilot Wings did somewhat moderately okay, and it did really show off a lot of the graphical side of Super Nintendo when it launched with the Super Nintendo. So I guess they figured, oh, we'll just do this for Nintendo 64 too. You know, it's kind of have another big game going. So now, I don't know if this is supposed to be like Nestor. You know, I never did play 64 Pilot Wings, so I couldn't tell you, but it does look like Nestor from Nintendo Power Magazine, which is why I bring that up. And then here is a floor plan. Now these are like graph charts, and I like these. I think these are from actual development things. They call it vault stuff. But basically, this is for the castle and some other parts in Super Mario 64. So that's interesting. On the back of that, that's one of those things that if I had kept it stapled in, it wouldn't have made as much sense. Trying to take multiple pictures of it from 2 different sides from an open magazine. That's why I took the staple. Well, I didn't take the staples out, but I bent them down and got all the centerfolds out so that I could take pictures for you guys that are collecting, so that you know which ones come in each of these volumes. Here is volume 88, which is September 1996. Finally, Super Mario 64. And if we look back here, it says, I believe it is September is when it launched. Finally, after seemed like at that point like well over a year, because Killer Instinct was already out, and then Killer Instinct 2 was out. All those arcade games, some of them got ported in some way or some fashion to Super Nintendo instead. We had to wait. There was a lot of stuff, rumors of what Rare was doing next on for their Nintendo's next generation machine, all that stuff. So they called it the Fun Machine. They launched with a bunch of different colors for the controllers. I mean, it was pretty phenomenal, and the fears of the PlayStation, especially in Japan, were kind of squandered right at that time in history, because like Nintendo 64 was a huge launch. But as the months went on and there wasn't enough big games, that's when PlayStation took over pretty much Japan and Europe and a lot of the world. Some would say America, but I think Nintendo 64 held its own in America very well, considering the support that Sony had versus the support that Nintendo did not have. And a lot of people would say, oh, Pokemon carried them through. Now, during this time, this is when about one Pokemon comes out. They make some mentions of that in Pocket Monsters or Pocket Monster Trainer in Nintendo Power Magazine. And Gail Tilden, who was, I believe, still editor-in-chief in Nintendo Power Magazine at this time, was key and elemental in getting Pokemon over here, and that was like huge. And Pokemon is the hugest franchise of video games and of anything else. Bigger than Disney, bigger than Marvel. I'm not joking. Look it up. When it comes to, merchandising and the money that it's made and all the different things, the different avenues, comics, cards, and everything else. Not to go on this long Pokemon tangent or whatever, but this was the year that started to come to America, and that was a big deal. Here you got a Turok Dinosaur Hunter. That was during the days of when Acclaim was actually starting to become a good thing. And it's really sad what happened with them as time went on, but there you go. On the back of that centerfold is Kirby. I believe this is Kirby Superstar, and these are some. I think this is after you beat the game. There's still more stuff that you could do. This is a Super Power Supplies catalog, a special one. It is a Nintendo 64 themed Super Power Supplies catalog. This was a wraparound one, that's why it's a different shape. It was stapled around the wraparound of the cover because around that time Nintendo Power magazines had staple bindings. And then here is Mortal Kombat Trilogy, separate from Mortal Kombat 3, by the way. And I believe this was it brought out? I know that there was a Mortal Kombat on 64, but I can't remember. I think it was just 64, maybe. This one was on Super Nintendo, and also at the same time you got Street Fighter Alpha 2, which that is an extremely odd game that they brought over to the Super Nintendo. A technical marvel if you want to look into it. I mean, it's pretty awesome. But I guess fighting games were still a big thing on Nintendo 6 or on Super Nintendo, and they were trying to get that to be a thing on 64. It didn't really work out. There was a lot of fighting games on 64, but 64 was more known for racing games and platformers, and later on the first-person shooters and war type games, and Tom Clancy and the Star Wars games were big on 64. Blah, blah, blah. The fighting games never really took off on 64 like they did with the Super Nintendo was the home. And here you got Killer Instinct, and you've got Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter. Those are the biggest names, and they were all on Super Nintendo, so even as the 64 was coming in. The centerfold for volume 89, which is October of 1996, is Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Now this one didn't do as well as the first two Donkey Kong Countries. Maybe it was the Nintendo 64 hype, maybe it was because it didn't have Donkey or Diddy in it. Whatever. On the back of that, there is... What is this? Pilot Wings 64. Again, there's some... these are Class P, which I guess is the higher class in the game. Again, I haven't played it, so even after all these years. Class P strategies, so... And then in the center of that was Street Fighter Alpha 2 cards. I love this artwork. And there's the back of the cards. And also in this volume, now this was painstaking to take this out because I didn't want to rip it apart to get it out or tape it back together or whatever. It was about, about 10 pages into the magazine, maybe 20. Here's the thing, and this was before before Blockbuster was a big deal back then, and Nickelodeon was becoming a big deal, or if it wasn't already. I personally didn't have a cable when I was a kid, or around this time. I guess I was growing up at this point, starting to get a job and all this other stuff. But yeah, so there's Alex Mack. I guess that was a Nickelodeon thing in the beginning. and there was all these things about Hey Arnold and all this other stuff on Nickelodeon. And they had a cross promotion with Nintendo for Nintendo 64 Spot the Dot. Now, I took this out. It folds over, flaps over. This is the front or the back of it. I can't remember. But there was, rentals that you could do at Blockbuster. This was a big deal in Nintendo 64 launch. They also had a Taco Bell thing, but they didn't put that in Nintendo Power Magazine, so that's kind of weird that they never mentioned that. But here's this, and I never scratched this off. I never played this game. I didn't even realize at the time. I think I wasn't like anti-Nickelodeon or whatever. I just was like, it's on cable. I can't watch it, so I don't like it. I don't want it. That kind of thing. But here's this. There was a lot of clubs that actually started around that time. There was, what Taco Bell was doing, Kellogg's was doing stuff, Dr. Pepper was doing stuff. I mean, Nintendo 64 launch was pretty big. And, I mean, this was one of the first times that restaurants, well, it was fast food, but, you got to figure Taco Bell, every generation has been on top of it with like their own Taco Bell version of a PlayStation or an Xbox or, but it started with this Nintendo 64. Now, again, they didn't go into that in Nintendo Power Magazine, which I thought was kind of funny, or, peculiar why they didn't, but they did have this. So I took that out so that you could see it. Wasn't a subscriber bonus or anything like that. It was just one of those weird things that I thought would be worth mentioning because it was, just kind of hanging out in the magazine. Here is November, volume 90. Wow, of Nintendo Power Magazine, and you got Donkey Kong Country 3 on the cover. Still Super Nintendo, so even though 64 was just launching and everything. That it was big that year. Nintendo 64 was huge. I gotta tell you. This is the Wave Race 64, and this was, Nintendo had a promotion with Kawasaki and all this other stuff too, for the game itself. That's was not like them to do that, but there were rare cases when they did that. This is the centerfold, and on the back of the centerfold they had the Batty Bounty inventory of areas. So I guess this shows you, places you could go to get certain items or stars and stuff like that in Super Mario 64. People were finding it's kind of like Breath of the Wild on Switch, although Switch didn't have the same problem that Nintendo 64 had and lack of titles. The reason why Mario 64, people were finding new ways to play. People still speedrun to this day and do glitches and all kinds of, like, is Luigi in the game and all this other, how do you get to Yoshi? And it was crazy. It was crazy. And this was kind of the beginnings of that, because since there wasn't a lot of games on 64, when it launched, Mario 64 was what most people, you got a 64 to play Mario. And Mario 64 was a big deal. It was 3D movement with the 3D control stick. That was a new thing. Even PlayStation didn't have that. PlayStation did the DualShock the following year and remade some games just to have analog control and all this other stuff. And they had two sticks. And then when Nintendo had a Rumble Pack, they had two Rumbles. It was a back and forth there. This is the Superpower Supplies catalog for winter of 1996. This would have come around November of 96 and around volume 90. Now we're at the final volume, 91, December 1996. This is Killer Instinct Gold, which is what Killer Instinct 2 earlier in the year ended up turning into on Nintendo 64. There was no FMV, like CMD type or CHD, or what do they call that? That's what they call it in Maine when you try to find the actual files. It was basically a hard drive, computer hard drive is I think what that stands for. That was in some of these machines. Area 51, a lot of games that had full motion video used them. It was like, oh, we can stick a hard drive in an arcade game. Wow, that's amazing. Well, Nintendo 64 sticked with carts, and so they didn't have those same kind of or not visuals, but like basically tricks, little movies that would play in between matches to show off, who's fighting who, and you know, it wasn't really fatalities because that was more of a Mortal Kombat thing, but still, Killer Instinct had those kind of things where they had finishers and stuff, and but that was not in there, so they didn't call it Killer Instinct 2. They called it Killer Instinct Gold. The centerfold here is Shadows of the Empire, Star Wars. This was a big deal. I love that game, and I love the story behind it. It was awesome. They should turn that into a movie. And then on the back of that centerfold, this is the last picture to show you guys, is some courses in Wave Race 64. So yeah, thanks for watching. Next month will be 1997. That is the year that I graduated. That is the year that, like, Nintendo 64 was really hitting a stride. You had Mario Kart 64. You had, I think, did Smash Brothers come out that year? GoldenEye 64. You had all these great games that kind of defined it, and you'll see in the next year, 1997, next month when I do my checklist for Nintendo Power Magazine. Thanks for watching.